Okay, now ongoing study on grief and death, for this week in our Being with Jesus reading. Heard about different aspects of grief and all that, and our brother Henry briefly shared on the 5 stages of grief. Okay, today I'll revisit that and maybe spend a bit more time in this whole area of what we call the 5 stages of grief. Now, these 5 stages of grief, as Henry said, was postulated years ago. But just to be mindful, not everybody agrees on all these stages. So I think that's important to understand. Now, so this is a postulated theory of the stages we go through in grieving, but it's just a postulate and it's a good guide. As far as scientific evidence is concerned, actually there's no clear scientific paper to demonstrate all this, because grief is a very complicated process and it's hard to even see all the stages all the time, but it's a good guide to help us to understand the whole process of grieving. Okay, so the 5 stages, they normally start with the whole area of denial. Okay, when especially if the one that we have lost. Okay, let's limit to grief for death of a loved ones lah. Okay, we won't talk about the rest. Okay, so denial is the first stage, because sometimes we find very hard to accept, especially if the death comes suddenly, unexpectedly. The person has not been ill or not been sick and all that. Okay, there's always this whole stage of denial. So I think it's something for us to be important to remember, okay? Because if we don't, in the way, don't accept it lah, okay, then we have to, for us, in a way to move on. So after denial, that depends how long it lasts and how close we are to the person, how sudden is the effect. Okay, so that's the first stage that we leave. And this person rightly pointed out that at the end of it, in all our troubles, God is there with us. So even when we deny it, as Christians, we in a way have God to turn to. We have God to minister to us and for us to pour out our sorrows. Okay, so denial is a very normal aspect of a grieving process. But it's always good to remember that God is there lah. So it's important for us to remember that part of denial. Then we go on to anger, okay? Anger even with God, because especially the loved one who is well and sick and suddenly die, okay? Not only we find hard to accept it, but we get angry. And a lot of times we lash out at God even to say, how can this happen? Especially if a good Christian serving the Lord and doing the Lord's ministry and work. So I think it's okay to get angry. It's okay to pour out your anger with God, as Job did. Okay, Job very upset, asking for answers. Okay, so but we need to remember that even when we are angry, okay, that we must not in the way curse God. We must not in the way turn away from God. So Ephesians 4:26 reminds us, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. That's good for relationship, but in grief, it may last a bit longer lah. We may not even get over the anger overnight. It's not possible in most cases, okay? So it's perfectly okay for you to get angry, even angry with God. God may give you an answer, God may not give you an answer. But it's good for us to be transparent and forthright with God. If you're feeling angry, tell God you're angry, and that's perfectly okay. So after denial, after anger, whole area of bargaining, okay? Is there another way, okay? Is there anything that we have done that could have prevented the death of our loved ones? Is there any other thing that we should have said, should have done, and all that? So we go to the whole process of what if, okay? It's a very natural grieving process. And then a lot of times the question we ask, there's no answer. because in all our grief, we can't bring the person back. Okay, what if he had exercised more? What if I control his diet? What if the kind of thing? Okay, but at the end of it, death is death. But we still go through this bargaining within ourselves, bargaining even with God, bargaining even the family members and all that, to try to come to a different so-called scenario. So God is okay with that. I mean, you can get angry with God, you can try to bargain with God, but at the end of it, it's God's will that will stand. It's God's will that will prevail in all our bargaining. Okay, so I think we need to understand that in the whole area of grief, yes, there'll be denial, hard to accept. We get angry, we can bargain and try to do the what if scenarios. But hopefully this will not last too long. Then this is the most frightening stage when we go to depression. When we go to depression, when we get so sad that instead of venting out our emotions and our anger, we turn inward and get into a state of depression where you start feeling down, no strength to do anything, no heart to do anything, okay? It's this time when we get inward, drawn inward, that's the dangerous part. And sometimes depression, if you don't get out of it, we can lead on to other things, even suicide. So I think it's a stage of depression that friendship and a relationship will help us to be with us and to allow us to go through that stage and to continue to keep us in the way company. A lot of our grieving, we don't have all the answers, but it's good to have friends who care for us, who will walk with us through this stage of depression. And this is in a way the most dangerous part of the grieving process. If we never step out of it, then we may end up never being able to function. I think that's important for us even to remember. Okay, so we be careful in our grieving process that we won't get so depressed, that we start withdrawing from people, isolating from people, isolating from our family, isolating from our friends. And that will not help the whole situation. Okay, so this is the part of the grieving process that needs the most help as such. And we hope that as we work through the depression, that we'll get the whole area acceptance, that we accept the situation that our loved ones have gone on, loved ones have passed away, okay? And we accept the fact, and from there, we can begin the healing process and move on in life. So I think these are roughly the 5 stages of grief as such. It comes to a shock, and the death is sudden. There will be a denial, okay? And we get angry. Sometimes get angry, how come you die before me kind of mentality, okay? Then at the same time, we will have all kind of bargaining position even with God. Then we can enter a state of depression. But we need to come out into a state of acceptance, to accept the reality of a loss of loved ones and be able to move on with life, move on with what we need to do. I think this is important. Now, just to mention that this all 5 sounds very good on paper, sounds very good in theory, okay? But it's not a linear process. Some people is so shocked at the beginning. They don't even have a stage of denial or anger. They just go through the motion and prepare the funeral and all that. Only after the funeral that the whole thing strikes them. They get very angry, they deny the whole thing and all that. Okay, so the stage is not linear. The grieving stages are not linear. Okay, and there's no set time frame for how long. So it's important for us to remember that the grieving process is unique to each person. So there's no set time frame as such, okay? And even after a long time, times of anger can still come back when we remember, when something triggers it and all that, okay? So these 5 stages of grief is not cast in stone. Doesn't mean that, okay, you're allowed to deny 1 hour, angry with 1 day, then you go to bargaining for 2 days, and then depression for 1 week, and then acceptance after that. There's no such nice moving on to grief. So I hope that even as you talk about grief and death, okay, at least you must understand the concept of these stages. And as we try to minister and comfort those who have lost a loved one and all that, then we are mindful, okay, to see if they get angry and start yelling and shouting at you, don't get upset. Okay, it's a process they need to go through. And it's important for us to be able to remember that for all our lives as we want to minister to people. Okay, now I'm going to show you a short video. I think this is quite well done, but it's not from a Christian source, like a non-Christian source. Just listen to it. I think there's some truth to help us.
Most people know the common 5 to 7 stages of grief: shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and acceptance. Everyone experiences these stages in entirely different ways. While you're grieving, many people will tell you something along the lines of, stay strong, or it'll get better. While those are predictable and well-intentioned things to say in an attempt to comfort someone, they're not always true. When I was younger, I experienced more than my fair share of grief. And after years of reflection, I've come to understand that there is more to grieving than most people realize. I would like to share with you 5 things about grieving that I desperately wish someone would have shared with me. 1. We grieve for more than the dead. Yes, the death of a human being is the most common source of grief, but it's not the only one. You can experience the whole force of grief for anything important to you. You can grieve the loss of a pet. You can mourn the loss of a sentimental object, the loss of a beloved place, or of any kind of relationship or connection. Nothing has to die in order for you to go into mourning. There can be grief for a friendship that has just drifted apart, or for the ending of your favorite book series, a home that you've had to move away from. You can grieve for yourself. When you grow and change as a person, pieces can be left behind. Old bits of a personality and mannerisms that we can ache for all the same. Whenever something is lost, no matter what, no matter why, and it causes pain in its absence, that is grief. 2. Just stay strong typically goes hand in hand with the denial phase of grief. It's when you're told that despite all the terrible things happening to you, you must stay strong and overcome it. What is not said is that just stay strong should mean when you're done properly grieving, you will still be alive. This will not kill you. You are stronger than your tragedy. Instead of pretend like nothing's wrong, don't let your tragedy affect you. Just keep living regardless. Denial is usually said to be the first or second stage of grief. If you find yourself stuck there, you will never eventually get to acceptance, and you will never really be out of your cycle of grief. It's okay to not be strong. That's what people should tell you when you're beginning to grieve. It's all right to cry, to scream, to take time away. It's understandable to feel weak for a bit, so long as you learn to let that weakness go. You do not have to stay strong. If you do, moving on may become difficult. Weakness and vulnerability is part of the grieving process, and it should be accepted. 3. There should be a guilt phase of grief. Often when we lose something, those of us that are still here feel a sense of guilt. Some people feel left behind. Some feel survivor's guilt, in which they believe they should also be gone, or should have died in the other's place. Some simply regret what they missed out on before the end. They regret something they said or did, or the lack thereof. We find a way to place the blame on ourselves, find a way to make circumstances our fault, even when it's not. Facing death often precedes a reevaluation of life. It's only natural that we question things in our time of grief. It's normal to find regrets. You're always going to feel like you could have done something. You're not weird or unhealthy to feel a sense of guilt, but you need to learn to let it go eventually. There's nothing to gain from holding on to it. Instead, turn that guilt into nutriment for what is still alive. Learn from your regrets and use them as a guide to ensure that you live the life you have to the fullest. 4. time means little to the act of grieving. It does not heal all wounds, but merely smooths them over, making it easier to forget their presence. It'll get better is nice, though not necessarily true. And that's okay. There are some things that'll never really go away. Some scars never fade, but that's a fact of life and part of you. It's normal to still be haunted by things that happened long ago, to still grieve years later. Do not be down on yourself for being emotionally caught up in the past sometimes. You can't just ignore trauma and tragedy and hope that it'll go away. Nothing fixes itself. To heal requires treatment, whether that be through outside assistance or internal reflection. Acceptance will not just roll around to you. You have to get there yourself. 5. Acceptance is more complicated than just admitting to a loss. Acceptance is not a finish line. There is no real finish line with grieving, because grief is not a marathon. Rather than a straight shot to the end, it's a winding and confusing maze. Nor is it a one-and-done thing. More than likely, you will find yourself going through the cycle of grief several times throughout your life, and chances are you will grieve the same thing more than once. You can regress, and that's perfectly okay. You could be done with grieving for years when suddenly something triggers you and you have to go through it all over again. This usually happens if you did not let yourself grieve properly the first time, but it can still happen to those that have had the proper closure. We're never really done with grieving. We will grieve for as long as we live. The cycle of grief goes hand in hand with the cycle of life, but that is nothing to be afraid of. In order to accept our losses, we must accept the cycle of grief for all that it is.
Okay, I just hope that that short devotion, the short video will help us. So grief is a very complicated process. We can put it very nicely, but it does not happen so nicely. Okay, and then each person grieves differently for different length of time, and different things trigger us. So that's important for us to remember.